Select your weapon of choice. This is Rad Racer on the Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1987. This is a game that lives up to its title, because Rad Racer is totally rad. Rad is short for radical, which back in the 80s meant basically the same thing as awesome or tubular, except rad is, I think, highest on the level. Like, it would be Admiral on the 1980s coolometer scale, which is appropriate for this game because this is the Admiral of mid-1980s home console racing games. At first glance, when you look at Rad Racer, it may not look terribly different than OutRun or numerous other driving games from the era, but it is in fact completely different. For starters, I love OutRun, but this is just a totally different game than OutRun, both in the way it's structured and also in the controls. What may not be immediately apparent on screen is how well the game plays and how excellent the controls are for an old school game like this, an old school driving game in particular. It plays like you'd expect. You hold down one button for gas, the other Nintendo button is brake. If you push up, you get a turbo boost. Pushing down changes radio stations. And you'll frequently hear me changing radio stations as I'm driving, mashing on the D-pad. The competition in Rad Racer is excellent and doesn't have any issues where if you run into an opposing car, your car explodes into a fireball. You can actually bump into other cars, and depending how fast you're going, if you're on a turn, your car will react differently. So it won't totally end your race if you run into somebody, unless you run into somebody and they end up knocking you off the road, and then you run into a palm tree and your car goes flipping in the air and crashes and then sets you back several seconds. But it's that variable set of bad things that can happen to your car if you run into someone that sets Rad Racer apart. Sometimes you'll get knocked off the road and it won't affect you because there won't be a sign or a cactus or a palm tree. Other times, you're passing somebody innocently, and then the other guy's driving like a complete jackass and intentionally runs you off the road. I love that about Rad Racer. And that's how you win a race, upside down, spinning through the air. That qualifies as radical. These cars have adamantium roll cages. This game requires some patience at times, which, again, for an old-school driving game, is quite rare because you can get into spots where there's three opposing cars right in front of you, literally blocking the road, and you just have to find your way around them and then hit the turbo and accelerate past them. OutRun was more about actually driving somewhere, and you were timed on the entire race from start to finish. OutRun also has a timing clock, and if you don't make it to a certain point in the race by a certain time, it's game over, you've ended your race. Rad Racer doesn't work the same way. In the bottom left you can see the time, and when the clock runs out in Rad Racer, your car continues rolling. So you can actually run out of gas and then roll for a good half mile through the checkered flag or through a checkpoint and just keep going. As long as your car keeps rolling and doesn't come to a stop, you can continue. OutRun was originally produced as an arcade game from Sega, and then brought over to home consoles like the Sega Master System. That's why I believe the time clock in OutRun was less forgiving, because when your game is up, they wanted you to put more quarters into the machine. Rad Racer was created for the home market, and I think they wanted you to be able to play the game for longer periods of time. And the Nintendo Entertainment System is, I think, where a lot of Americans, at least, started seeing that change from arcade games over to home console-specific games. Games that were meant to last a long time, like Zelda and Metroid, for example. and that change is more subtle in driving games, but I think that Rad Racer is a good example of that. And there's that extra thrill that you get when you're just rolling for victory. Anyway, I love both games. And you can see my review of OutRun for the Sega Master System. In Rad Racer, you drive through these levels. Graphically, it does a great job. It has hills. The backgrounds have some neat parallax scrolling on them. And there's 8 levels in total. It's a challenging game, requires some skill and some practice. You can drive very fast, you can use your turbo. The signs telling you what direction the road's going to turn are somewhat difficult to read. So repeat playing over the levels certainly will help your score in your game. At the beginning of the game, you can choose either the Ferrari or the Formula 1 car. I didn't notice any difference between the two. And one other thing about Rad Racer, this game actually has a 3D mode. Although I picked up this game used and sadly don't have any 3D glasses to try out that feature. Maybe in the future I'll come by some and then we can do a review of Rad Racer in 3D. But that might just be more radical than even I can handle. And they rub in the fact that I almost made it to the end of the race. Insert expletive here. If you like old school driving games, you've got to play Rad Racer.